J.D. Vance asked Gavin Newsom one question on live television, and the politician who had spent years polishing himself into a national brand suddenly collided with the one thing political choreography cannot outrun: arithmetic. California had spent roughly $37 billion on homelessness, while about 187,000 people still lived in shelters, cars, tents, sidewalks, and public spaces. Divide the spending against the scale of the crisis, and the figure approaches $197,000 per person. Enough to force even Sacramento's loyal defenders to stop reciting slogans and start demanding receipts. The money did not end homelessness, reverse the trend, or produce one clean statewide accounting showing taxpayers exactly what they bought. The crisis remained visible, the spending kept rising, and the government responsible for both still could not present a unified ledger. That was what made Vance's attack more dangerous than an ordinary partisan accusation. He was not relying on rumor, ideology, or some anonymous source feeding him opposition research. He was using California's own budgets, audits, promises, and public records against the governor who had signed off on the entire machine. Newsom could dismiss Republican outrage as theater, but he could not wave away evidence generated by the state he controlled. The real question was not whether homelessness was complicated, but whether a governor spending at this scale had built any reliable system for proving where the money went and whether it worked. 11 minutes into the town hall, Newsom had been winning exactly the kind of event designed for a politician like him. He moved through California's economy, technology sector, climate agenda, and global influence with the practiced confidence of a man who had spent decades making ambition sound like competence. Every transition was smooth, every phrase polished, and every claim delivered as though certainty itself were proof. He presented California not merely as a powerful state, but as a national model of progressive government operating at full scale. For those opening minutes, the event looked less like a defense of a damaged record than a rehearsal for a larger national campaign. Then, the moderator turned to Vance, and the atmosphere changed without raised voices or theatrical outrage. Vance looked at his laptop instead of Newsom, the audience, or the cameras, signaling that he was not entering the governor's preferred arena of performance. He acknowledged what was true. California's economy was enormous. Its influence was undeniable, and its output rivaled major nations. Then he introduced the fact Newsom had carefully kept outside the frame, that California also had the largest homeless population in America. That pivot did not deny California's power. It exposed how badly that power had been managed. Vance's argument was brutal because he was not claiming California lacked money, talent, institutions, or administrative reach. He was arguing that the state possessed all those advantages, spent at a level few governments could match, and still failed to produce results remotely proportional to the investment. A poor state can blame scarcity, but a wealthy state that spends tens of billions and cannot reconcile its own records has a different problem. That is not simply policy failure. It is managerial negligence, wrapped in the language of compassion. Newsom had spent years using scale as proof of seriousness, and Vance was now turning that same scale into evidence of failure. The weakness became obvious when Newsom's team tried to gather the numbers needed for a defense. There was no single database, ledger, or statewide system tracing money from appropriation to measurable outcome. There were 6 different tracking systems, and they did not match. 6 systems for one crisis, tens of billions moving through overlapping programs, and no authoritative account showing what worked, what failed, or what should have been stopped. Before Vance finished the calculation, the administration's own fragmented machinery had already validated the accusation. Vance then read from state auditor reports, budget records, investigations, and public documents produced by California itself. Since 2019, the state had spent approximately $37 billion, while homelessness rose from about 151,000 people to roughly 187,000, an increase of around 36,000. The calculation was not a complete policy formula, but it exposed the staggering scale of what government had consumed without delivering a comparable transformation. Newsom could still name programs, blame national forces, and distribute responsibility across cities, counties, agencies, and contractors. But none of that repaired the missing accountability. And the next document in Vance's record was even more damaging, because it suggested California had been offered a direct path to transparency, and the governor himself chose to block it. The document was Assembly Bill 293, introduced by California Assemblyman Josh Hoover, to require agencies handling homelessness programs to report annually how much they spent, where the money went, and whether the programs produced measurable results. Nothing about that proposal was radical, because any household, business, or local government moving even a fraction of that money would be expected to keep records. The bill passed both chambers of the California legislature, showing that lawmakers recognized the existing system was not delivering the transparency taxpayers deserved. Gavin Newsom vetoed it, turning a story about weak oversight into a darker question about why the governor resisted a law designed to expose weak oversight. Once that veto entered the record, the administration could no longer pretend the lack of clarity was merely a product of bureaucracy. Vance closed the laptop because the accusation no longer required another chart, table, or government acronym. California had spent $37 billion. The state auditor said the tracking was inconsistent. Lawmakers passed a bill to force annual reporting, and the governor blocked it. Vance offered two explanations. Either Newsom knew where the money went and did not want the public to see it, or he did not know and did not want the public to discover that he had lost control. Newsom reached for his water glass with the controlled movements of a politician trained to make every gesture look casual, but the timing exposed the pressure because he had not been speaking long enough to need it. Under high-definition cameras, a brief pause can reveal what polished language is designed to conceal. Vance then placed three promises from different stages of Newsom's career beside the results that followed. In 2004, as mayor of San Francisco, Newsom promised homelessness would be ended within 10 years. Yet, the crisis remained, and the population later rose. In 2020, as governor, he again declared that homelessness could be solved, and in 2021, he promised to end family homelessness within 5 years. But families were still sleeping in shelters, vehicles, temporary rooms, and public spaces. One failed promise can be defended as optimism, and a second blamed on changing conditions. But decades of escalating commitments, expanding bureaucracies, and rising expenditures shift the burden onto the politician announcing the next deadline. By then, the pattern was no longer a communication problem, but a governing record. Vance brought up 4-year-old Michaela Williams, photographed sleeping on a Sacramento park bench beside a bag of toys because her parents had nowhere else to go. She was not a budget category, a county implementation issue, or a statistic to bury beneath statewide initiatives. She represented the families Newsom had promised would no longer be homeless, making every excuse about complexity sound smaller beside a child sleeping outside. Newsom answered that homelessness was a national crisis driven by housing costs, mental illness, migration, and structural forces beyond one state's control. But none of those factors explained why California lacked a reliable accounting of its own spending. Complexity made serious measurement more necessary, not less. The contrast sharpened when Vance returned to the people financing those promises. Dorothy Chin, a retired Sacramento teacher living on a $3,400 monthly pension while paying $1,900 in rent, represented Californians who had worked for decades, yet remained one emergency away from instability. While people like Dorothy absorbed rising housing costs, Newsom attended the French Laundry dinner in November 2020. While restaurants were closed, workers were losing income, and ordinary citizens carried restrictions. political insiders appeared able to ignore. Vance did not need to embellish the image, because a governor dining with lobbyists at an expensive restaurant while families struggled under rules he defended already exposed the hierarchy. The people at the top enjoyed discretion, while the public received mandates, promises, and the bill. Newsom finally fought back by standing, accelerating his delivery, and naming Project Homekey, the CARE Act, the Encampment Resolution Fund, and other programs meant to prove California was acting at unmatched scale. The programs were real, some people had been housed, and individual initiatives had produced benefits, but that was never the question Vance had placed before him. Newsom had promised 5 million new homes by 2025, yet only about 640,000 had been built, roughly 18% of the target, and calling it a stretch goal did not rescue the arithmetic. 18% of a promise is not near success. It reveals how far the announcement stood from delivery. And beyond the cameras, the first people to grasp what that failure meant were donors and campaign operatives already calculating what the $37 billion question could do to Newsom's national ambitions. In the green room, Jake Ellison's phone buzzed with a message from the 2028 finance chair. They needed to talk. Those words did not mean a minor adjustment to messaging, another policy memo, or a request for stronger debate preparation. Donors had watched the same exchange as everyone else and reduced it to a devastating summary. $37 billion spent, no unified tracking system, no clean outcome story, and no direct answer. Complicated attacks can be delayed, reframed, or buried beneath counter-arguments, but a simple number attached to a simple question is far harder to neutralize. Once voters can repeat the accusation without needing a briefing book, the campaign loses control of how the issue is understood. Within 72 hours, 2 clips dominated the political conversation and accumulated millions of views across television, social media, and partisan news platforms. The first centered on the arithmetic, because the calculation transformed a sprawling policy crisis into something ordinary people could understand immediately. California's homelessness spending had been public for years, but no one had forced Newsom to confront the scale of it in such a stripped-down form. The second clip spread because of the judgment behind it. The money vanished, the houses vanished, the promises vanished, while the homeless population remained. That line compressed years of missed targets, rising expenditures, and broken deadlines into a political weapon requiring almost no explanation. Republican strategists immediately recognized the clip as ready-made material for any future national campaign against Newsom. Democratic strategists understood the danger even when they rejected Vance's harsh framing, because the exchange had created a lens through which every future announcement would be judged. From that moment forward, another homelessness program would not be received simply as action, but as another test of whether the administration could prove anything worked. Every new appropriation risked reviving the same question about where the previous billions had gone. Vance had not merely criticized a policy. He had established a frame capable of swallowing every defense Newsom offered afterward. The first week after the town hall brought something Newsom could not dismiss as conservative amplification. California media began reopening budget documents, comparing homelessness programs, examining audits, and reconstructing the state's fragmented approach to outcome reporting. The most damaging finding was not that every dollar had literally disappeared or that every program had failed. It was that consistent, auditable, statewide data did not exist in a form allowing the public to trace massive spending cleanly from allocation to measurable result. That distinction should have softened the charge, but politically it strengthened it by confirming that the government had spent first and built accountability later. The Sacramento Bee editorial board, hardly a natural ally of Vance, demanded an answer that did not consist of another acronym. Californians already knew homelessness was severe, already knew billions had been spent, and already knew the state had launched initiative after initiative. What Vance had done was attach one memorable number to years of public frustration and force the governor to defend it without hiding behind administrative vocabulary. Once a politician's own media environment begins asking for an answer beyond program names, the standard defense has already failed. The machinery Newsom used to prove action had become evidence that action was disconnected from clear results. By the second week, the damage moved from media criticism into the territory presidential campaigns fear most: electability. 3 major California real estate donors who had helped raise millions for Newsom's national ambitions requested private calls with his finance operation. They were not threatening to leave immediately, because that would have been easier to calculate and contain. They were asking what the campaign's answer was to the $37 billion question, and whether Newsom could survive the attack once opponents began repeating it nationally. Donors do not ask that because they suddenly care about administrative design. They ask because they are deciding whether the vulnerability can be repaired. Then, the state auditor announced an expanded review of the largest homelessness programs and billions of dollars in expenditures. The announcement was not proof of theft, corruption, or criminal wrongdoing, but politically, the timing was disastrous. An expanded audit following a viral confrontation did not make Vance's question look reckless. It made the question look serious enough to force the state itself to count again. Every document request, spending review, and attempt to connect appropriations to outcomes now existed inside the frame Vance had created. The man who opened a laptop and started counting had forced California's government to reconstruct what it should have tracked from the beginning. By the third week, Newsom held a 45-minute press conference devoted entirely to homelessness spending, complete with slides, tables, program explanations, and outcome claims. By any reasonable standard, the presentation contained substance, but that was precisely why it damaged him further. If the information had always existed in a clear and organized form, why had he failed to produce it when challenged on live television? If his staff needed weeks to reconcile multiple systems, then Vance's central accusation had already been validated before the first slide appeared. And the most damaging reversal was still ahead, because the transparency law Newsom had once rejected was about to return to his desk under conditions he could no longer control. The transparency law Newsom had vetoed returned, and this time he signed it without celebration, spectacle, or any attempt to present the reversal as a triumph. Assembly Bill 293 now required annual reporting on homelessness spending and outcomes, the same basic accountability standard the governor had previously rejected when the political cost of rejection appeared manageable. The signature did not erase the veto, because it confirmed that the original resistance had become impossible to defend after Vance exposed the weakness on national television. Newsom had not suddenly discovered that taxpayers deserved to know where billions went. He had discovered that refusing to tell them had become a threat to his political future. The difference mattered because accountability accepted under pressure is not evidence of leadership, but evidence that pressure finally became stronger than avoidance. The reversal received modest coverage compared with the original confrontation, which was exactly how political concessions are usually handled when the person making them would prefer the public not study the sequence too carefully. The veto had been a deliberate act of power, while the signature was a quiet retreat from a position that had become toxic. Between those two decisions stood the entire contradiction Vance had forced into public view. A governor who claimed he was no longer interested in funding failure had presided over enormous spending without a unified system capable of identifying failure consistently. Newsom's defenders could point to motel conversions, treatment programs, encampment clearances, and individuals who had genuinely been helped, but isolated success stories could not answer the scale of the expenditure. $37 billion demanded $37 billion worth of accountability, not a stack of disconnected program summaries assembled only after the governor had been cornered. Politico captured the political damage with a headline suggesting Newsom had finally answered the $37 billion question 3 weeks late and $37 billion short. The line was harsh, but it reflected the deeper failure more accurately than any simplistic accusation that every dollar had literally disappeared. The real scandal was not that all the money had been stolen, but that the state lacked one authoritative system capable of showing taxpayers in real time what the spending had achieved and where the failures remained. A government serious about results builds measurement into the program before the money moves, tracks performance continuously, publishes failures honestly, and stops funding what cannot demonstrate value. California instead allowed spending, bureaucracy, and political promises to expand faster than the systems designed to judge whether any of them worked. By the second month, Democratic rivals began using the language of accountability, measurable outcomes, transparency, and results-based governance without always mentioning Newsom by name. The omission made the message more pointed, because everyone understood which record they were separating themselves from and which future attack they were preparing to survive. National campaigns are often damaged long before voters cast ballots, when donors, strategists, journalists, and rival candidates decide which weakness will define a politician before the politician formally enters the race. The $37 billion question had become that kind of weakness because it could not be neutralized by another speech about California's size, ambition, innovation, or moral leadership. Newsom's political brand depended on movement and scale, but Vance changed the standard from how much government announced to what government could prove it delivered. That shift exposed the weakness beneath every polished answer, because once results replace intentions as the standard, a long list of programs stops sounding impressive and starts sounding like camouflage. The money had not vanished into thin air, but accountability had been fragmented so badly that the public could not follow the full path from appropriation to outcome. The promised 3. 5 million homes had not literally disappeared, but most had never been built, leaving the announcement detached from delivery and the deadline exposed as political theater. The promise to end family homelessness had passed, while children and parents still slept in cars, shelters, temporary rooms, and public spaces across California. The word vanished endured because it became shorthand for the distance between Newsom's promises and the reality Californians continued to see every day. Vance never needed to prove that every homelessness program was useless, because some clearly were not, and he never needed to claim that every dollar was stolen, because the accurate accusation was already damaging enough. California spent on a massive scale without maintaining a unified, reliable, publicly accessible system capable of connecting expenditures to outcomes with the clarity taxpayers had every right to demand. Newsom could blame housing costs, mental illness, migration, local governments, federal failures, and the complexity of the crisis, but none of those explanations justified weak measurement or the veto of stronger reporting. He had spent years presenting California as a national model of what progressive government could accomplish when given enough authority, money, and institutional reach. Vance forced America to examine the other side of that model. What happens when spending outruns oversight, ambition outruns delivery, and political branding outruns the record? That was why the final question survived every press conference, spreadsheet, program name, and defensive explanation that followed. Where did the money go, Governor? And why did California need a nationally televised confrontation before its own government began assembling an answer? The question became the distance between a veto and a signature, between a promise and a result, and between the image of a future president and the record of a governor who could not reconcile the ledger beneath him. Vance did not create the spending, the missed targets, the broken deadlines, the fragmented tracking, or the resistance to transparency. He simply opened the laptop, arranged the official numbers in the correct order, and counted what Gavin Newsom's government had failed to count clearly enough on its own.